Deputy vanished without a trace in 1986. 17 years later, a farmer finds this in his barn. In the summer of 1986, the town of Mill Creek carried the kind of stillness that people often associated with safety. It was a small place where families knew one another, neighbors trusted each other, and the sheriff's office mostly handled quiet matters like traffic stops, lost pets, or the occasional farm dispute. The town did not expect shocking events, and when they came, people remembered them forever. That year, the man everyone talked about was Deputy Mark Ellison, a respected officer who was known not just for his badge but also for his character. He was the kind of deputy who waved at children while patrolling, stopped to help stranded motorists, and never hesitated to walk an elderly person safely across the street. Mark had grown up in Mill Creek, the son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher. His roots in the town went deep, and so did his love for it. After finishing his training at the police academy, he had chosen to return to his hometown rather than pursue opportunities in larger cities. To him, wearing the deputy uniform was more than a job, it was a promise to protect the same streets he once rode his bike on as a boy. People admired him for his calm nature, his steady voice, and the fact that he always listened before making decisions. To his colleagues, he was dependable. To his family, he was a pillar of support. That summer, Mark's routine was like any other. He would begin his shift in the late afternoon, drive along the quiet highways, and stop by the gas station where the owner always offered him a free cup of coffee. By nightfall, he would usually head toward the more rural roads where farms stretched across acres, their barns standing like silent guardians under the moonlight. Nothing unusual ever happened on most nights, and Mark liked it that way. He believed peaceful nights meant the town was safe. But one evening, things changed. It was August, and the air was heavy with humidity. Mark's radio crackled with a call. The dispatcher's voice sounded routine, just another request to check on something reported near an old dirt road outside town. It wasn't considered dangerous, just a follow-up on a possible disturbance. Mark acknowledged the call, his voice calm as always. He turned his cruiser toward the long, empty stretch of road that led into the wooded edges of the county. No one knew at the time that it would be the last call he ever responded to. Hours passed, and the sheriff's office realized they hadn't heard back from Mark. At first, no one worried too much. Maybe his radio was out of range, or maybe he was still dealing with the matter. But as midnight approached, silence became concerning. Another deputy was sent to check on him. That deputy drove along the winding roads until he spotted something unusual: Mark's cruiser, headlights still on, engine running, sitting on the side of the dirt road. The driver's side door was open. The deputy called out his name, but the night only answered with crickets and the rustling of leaves. The discovery sent a wave of unease through the department. Mark's belongings, his hat, his notebook, even his half-finished coffee were still inside the car. But Mark himself was nowhere to be found. Flashlights cut through the darkness as deputies fanned out into the woods, their voices calling his name again and again. The night search stretched into dawn, but there was no sign of him. It was as though the deputy had stepped out of his cruiser and simply vanished into thin air. By morning, word had spread through Mill Creek. Families whispered on porches, store owners exchanged worried glances, and children asked their parents why Deputy Mark hadn't come back. His wife, Laura, waited anxiously at home, certain that any minute now, he would walk through the door with his steady smile. But hours turned into days, and hope began to wear thin. The sheriff's office launched a full search. Volunteers from the town joined law enforcement officers as they combed through forests, fields, and riversides. Helicopters hovered overhead, while bloodhounds sniffed through the terrain. Flyers with Mark's picture were posted in shop windows and gas stations, and reporters from neighboring towns came to cover the story. Yet, despite the efforts, no evidence surfaced. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, no answers. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Speculations began to grow. Some townsfolk whispered that maybe Mark had been targeted by criminals he once arrested. Others thought it might have been an accident, perhaps a fall into the river that carried him away. A few even suggested that he might have chosen to disappear on his own, though those who truly knew him rejected that idea completely. Mark was devoted to his family, his job, and his community. Walking away without a word was simply not in his nature. For his wife, the days were unbearable. Laura clung to their 2 children, trying to shield them from the questions and stares of others. She sat by the phone constantly, praying for news, any news that might tell her what had happened. Nights were the hardest, when silence filled the house where his laughter once echoed. She replayed the last conversation they had before he left for work, searching for clues in words that were probably nothing more than ordinary at the time. As weeks turned into months, the hope of finding Mark alive grew smaller. The sheriff's office kept the case open, refusing to give up, but eventually the search efforts slowed. Life in Mill Creek had to continue, though it never returned to normal. At the station, Mark's locker remained untouched, a silent reminder of his absence. His colleagues often paused by it, remembering the man who had been more than just a co-worker. He had been a friend. In town, the loss created a wound that did not heal. Children grew up remembering the kind deputy who once handed out stickers shaped like stars. Farmers recalled the times he had helped them with flat tires or missing livestock. His family, however, carried the deepest pain. They lived in a world of unanswered questions, torn between hope and grief. By the end of that year, the case of Deputy Mark Ellison had become one of Mill Creek's greatest mysteries. No matter how many theories were shared, the truth remained hidden. All anyone knew for certain was that a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others had stepped out of his cruiser one summer night in 1986 and never returned. For 17 long years, his name would echo in conversations, his story told and retold, always ending with the same haunting silence. The days following Deputy Mark Ellison's disappearance turned into a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. At first, the townspeople believed he would be found quickly. After all, how could a man just vanish in a place as small and familiar as Mill Creek? But as hours stretched into days, and days slipped into weeks, the situation became far more troubling. The sheriff's office worked tirelessly. Deputies spent long hours combing through the wooded areas around where Mark's cruiser had been discovered. They searched creeks, abandoned farmhouses, and even old wells that dotted the countryside. Volunteers joined in, bringing lanterns, flashlights, and even their own dogs to help track any scent. Helicopters from a nearby city police department circled above the thick forests, shining powerful beams of light into the darkness below. Yet, despite the intensity of the search, there was no trace of him. People in town started to feel uneasy. Mill Creek was supposed to be safe, a place where doors were left unlocked and children played freely in the streets until sunset. The idea that a respected deputy could vanish without leaving behind a clue unsettled everyone. Parents became cautious, keeping their children closer to home. Farmers began locking their barns and sheds at night. The sense of safety the community once took for granted was shaken to its core. As time passed, theories about what had happened to Mark began to grow. Some believed he had been targeted by someone he had arrested in the past. As a deputy, Mark had dealt with criminals from time to time, and though Mill Creek was quiet, there were still people who resented the law. Maybe someone waited for him out there, one shopkeeper whispered to a neighbor. The idea of revenge made sense to many, but there was still no proof. Others had different thoughts. Some believed he may have stumbled into an accident, perhaps falling into the river near the woods or injuring himself while chasing someone. But if that had been the case, wouldn't they have found his body by now? The dogs, the deputies, the helicopters, they had searched everywhere. It didn't seem possible that an accident could explain such a complete disappearance. A smaller group of people carried another theory, one that angered Mark's family. They suggested he had chosen to leave on his own. They pointed out that sometimes people led secret lives, hiding struggles that no one else could see. Maybe he just couldn't handle the stress, someone at the diner speculated. But those who truly knew Mark dismissed this quickly. He loved his wife, Laura, and his 2 children too much. He was dedicated to his job and to his town. He had no reason to walk away from the life he had built. The sheriff himself publicly rejected the idea that Mark had left willingly. At a town meeting held weeks after the disappearance, he stood in front of the gathered crowd and spoke with determination. Deputy Ellison was a loyal officer and a loyal family man. I believe something happened to him against his will, and we will not stop searching until we know the truth. The townspeople clapped, but their faces still carried the weight of worry. Mark's family endured the hardest burden of all. His wife, Laura, was caught between hope and despair. Each time the phone rang, her heart raced with the thought that it might be news about her husband. But time and again, the calls were either from concerned neighbors or from investigators who had nothing new to share. Nights were endless for her. She lay awake, staring at the empty space beside her in bed, wishing she could turn back time to that last day when he left for work. Their children asked questions she couldn't answer, and she struggled to keep their lives as normal as possible while carrying her own grief silently. The case also attracted attention from reporters outside of Mill Creek. News vans parked near the sheriff's office, their cameras capturing every update, no matter how small. For weeks, newspapers printed stories with headlines like "Deputy Still Missing After Massive Search" and "Small Town Gripped by Mystery Disappearance." Some reporters even interviewed locals, spreading both facts and rumors to readers far beyond the town. Mill Creek, once a quiet and unknown place, became the subject of wide curiosity. Despite all the attention, no new evidence appeared. The sheriff's department followed every possible lead. They interviewed people who had been arrested by Mark in the past, they questioned drifters passing through town, and they even looked into strangers who had recently visited the area. Nothing connected. Nothing pointed to what had truly happened that night. Months passed, and the seasons changed. The search parties grew smaller as people had to return to their jobs and daily lives. The sheriff's department still worked on the case, but the constant energy of the early days began to fade. Flyers of Mark's face that once looked crisp and new became worn and faded, curling on telephone poles and shop windows. Still, whenever someone looked at them, they felt the same pang of sadness. By the early 1990s, the case was officially labeled cold. That did not mean it was forgotten, but it meant there were no more active leads. For Mark's family, it was devastating. They were left with no closure, no explanation, only the endless ache of wondering. His children grew older, learning to live with the unanswered questions that shadowed their lives. His wife never stopped holding on to hope, though hope was often painful. She kept his belongings neatly packed away, unable to let go but unable to move forward either. In the community, the memory of Mark remained alive. His empty chair at the sheriff's office stood as a quiet reminder of both his service and his mystery. Every time new deputies were hired, they were told the story of Deputy Ellison, the man who had vanished without a trace. Townspeople spoke of him with respect, always adding, "We never did find out what happened." The mystery also gave rise to stories, almost like folklore. Around campfires, teenagers whispered about the deputy who disappeared and the possibility of something sinister lurking in the woods. Adults exchanged theories in hushed tones at church picnics or while waiting in line at the post office. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had the truth. Through it all, the sense of unease lingered. Mill Creek was never quite the same. The town tried to move on, but there was always a shadow. Each time another officer went out on patrol at night, families worried a little more. Each time a deputy didn't answer the radio right away, hearts skipped a beat. By the time 17 years had passed, The case of Deputy Mark Ellison was no longer front-page news, but it was never far from people's minds. For his family, the wound had never healed. For the town, the disappearance had become a part of its history, one of its darkest chapters. People still wondered, still speculated, and still hoped that one day, an answer would finally come. 17 years is a long time. For the family of Deputy Mark Ellison, those years stretched like an endless road with no clear destination. After the first few months of his disappearance, when the initial search efforts had ended, life did not return to normal. It reshaped itself around the absence of a husband, a father, a son, and a friend. For Laura, his wife, every day was a quiet battle. At first, she refused to believe that Mark was gone forever. She kept his clothes neatly hanging in the closet, his boots by the door, and his favorite coffee mug on the kitchen shelf. Whenever the phone rang, she rushed to answer it, convinced that it might be news of him. When headlights passed by their house late at night, her heart leapt with the hope that it was his cruiser returning. But as weeks turned into months, and months stretched into years, hope became something more complicated. It was still there, but it lived side by side with doubt, grief, and exhaustion. Their children grew up under the shadow of questions no one could answer. At school, classmates sometimes asked, "What happened to your dad?" It was not meant to be cruel, but it hurt all the same. They would answer quietly, "We don't know," and that truth weighed heavily on them. Milestones that should have been celebrated as a family, birthdays, graduations, holidays, were always marked by his absence. Family photos showed smiling faces, but the empty space beside them was always felt. Meanwhile, in the sheriff's office, Mark's story became part of the department's identity. New deputies who joined the force were told about the man who had once been their colleague and had vanished without explanation. His badge, carefully polished and framed, was displayed in the hallway. His locker was left untouched for many years, a silent memorial that officers passed by daily. For some, it was a reminder of the dangers of the job; for others, it was a sign of unfinished business that weighed on the entire department. In the community, the memory of the deputy never faded completely. Townspeople mentioned him in conversations, especially when anniversaries of his disappearance came around. Some lit candles in church for him, while others left flowers near the dirt road where his car had been found. But as the years passed, the shock softened into a quiet sadness. The story of Deputy Ellison became part of Mill Creek's history, retold like a legend to newcomers who asked why people in the town still spoke of him with such heaviness. Rumors continued to swirl, though most had grown weary of speculation. Some still believed Mark had been targeted, others clung to the idea of an accident, and a few whispered about secrets no one knew. But no matter how many theories were passed around, the truth remained locked away. With no new evidence, the mystery seemed frozen in time. For Laura, coping meant learning to live with uncertainty. She tried to rebuild her life for the sake of her children, but she never stopped waiting for answers. She attended counseling sessions, joined support groups for families of missing persons, and leaned on her faith when days felt unbearable. But the ache never left. She described it once to a close friend as living with a wound that never closes. As the years slipped by, even the smallest reminders brought her back to him. The sound of boots on gravel reminded her of the way he used to walk up their driveway. The smell of fresh coffee took her back to mornings they shared before he went to work. Sometimes, she thought she heard his voice calling from another room, only to realize it was just her memory playing tricks on her. The children, now teenagers and then young adults, carried their father's absence differently. His son looked up to his father so much that he considered following in his footsteps to join law enforcement. But the fear of repeating his father's fate made him hesitate. His daughter, meanwhile, found comfort in writing. She filled journals with letters addressed to her dad, sharing her dreams, struggles, and milestones with the hope that somehow he might know. Outside of the family, Mill Creek itself slowly changed with time. New shops opened, old ones closed, and families moved in and out. But for longtime residents, the deputy's disappearance was still one of the first stories they told newcomers when explaining the character of their small town. "It's quiet here," they would say, "but we had one mystery we never solved." At the sheriff's office, cold case files were reorganized over the years, but Mark's case always remained on top of the list. Detectives would occasionally reopen the folder, flip through the faded reports, and discuss whether new technology could uncover something missed before. But each time, they were forced to put the file back, unsolved. The years of silence created their own kind of haunting. It wasn't the haunting of ghosts or shadows, it was the haunting of questions left unanswered. Why did he stop his car that night? Who called him out there? Did he suffer? Did he know he would not return home? The silence around these questions grew heavier with each passing year. On anniversaries of his disappearance, the town would sometimes hold small gatherings. They weren't formal ceremonies, but people came together to remember. At one such gathering, a local pastor spoke softly to the group, saying, "We may not know the truth yet, but we know that he was a man of honor. And honor never vanishes." His words brought comfort, but not closure. For the children, growing into adulthood without their father shaped them in quiet ways. They became more resilient, more independent, but also more cautious. They understood early on that life could change without warning. Laura, watching them grow, felt both pride and sorrow: pride that they carried themselves with strength, sorrow that they had been forced to carry such a burden so young. 17 years is long enough for many things to change, but for the Ellison family, one thing never changed: the desire to know the truth. They had learned to keep living, to smile when possible, to celebrate life's joys, but beneath it all, the mystery remained. The years of silence had not erased their love for Mark, nor had it lessened their need for answers. And then, as the 17th year began to close, fate stirred. A farmer in the countryside, not far from where Mark's cruiser had once been found, was preparing to clean out his old barn. He had no idea that beneath the dust, hay, and forgotten boards lay something that would finally break the silence that had hung over Mill Creek for nearly 2 decades. The year was 2003, and life in Mill Creek had moved forward in many ways. New families had settled into town, businesses had come and gone, and children who once remembered Deputy Mark Ellison only as the missing officer were now adults with families of their own. For most people, the story of his disappearance had turned into something spoken of only occasionally, like a shadow from the past. But for Mark's family, the pain had never lessened. They had learned to live with unanswered questions, even if those questions still haunted them. On the outskirts of Mill Creek lived a farmer named John Macaulay. He was a quiet man, known for his hard-working nature and for tending to his family's land, which stretched over many acres. John's barn was old, built decades earlier by his father, and though it had once been the heart of his farm, over the years it had become more of a storage place. Dusty tools, broken machinery, and stacks of hay filled its corners. Parts of the barn had gone untouched for years. That spring, John decided it was finally time to clean out the old structure. He planned to rebuild sections of it and make it useful again. The barn doors creaked as he pushed them open one morning. Sunlight filtered in through the cracks in the wooden walls, casting narrow beams of light across the dusty floor. He carried with him the determination to clear out the clutter, not knowing that what he would find that day would change everything. As John worked, he dragged out old boxes, swept piles of hay, and shifted wooden planks that had long since fallen to the ground. Hours passed, and the barn grew lighter, emptier. But in the farthest corner, behind stacks of forgotten boards and beneath layers of hay, he noticed something odd. It wasn't the shape of a tool or a piece of equipment. Instead, it was something small, round, and metal that caught the glimmer of sunlight. Curious, John bent down and brushed away the hay. At first, it looked like nothing more than a rusted piece of metal. But as he held it closer, he realized it was a badge. A sheriff's deputy badge. His heart skipped a beat. Mill Creek was a small town. Badges like this were not easily lost, nor were they common to find in an old barn. Puzzled, John set the badge aside and continued brushing away more hay. That's when he saw the outline of something else, partly hidden beneath the boards. An old pair of boots, worn and weathered, but unmistakably out of place. The more he uncovered, the more unsettled he felt. His hands slowed, his breath grew heavier, and a chill ran down his spine. John stepped back, realizing this was no ordinary discovery. He rushed outside and called the sheriff's office immediately. His voice trembled as he explained that he had found something unusual in his barn and that they needed to come at once. Within an hour, law enforcement arrived. The sheriff himself, now an older man with grayer hair than he'd had 17 years earlier, stepped inside the barn with deputies following close behind. As John led them to the corner, silence fell over the group. Flashlights illuminated the area as investigators carefully lifted boards and shifted hay. What they uncovered stunned everyone. Beneath the layers of time lay skeletal remains, resting in the quiet darkness of the barn for nearly 2 decades. Alongside them were belongings that seemed frozen in time: the badge, the boots, and fragments of a uniform. The deputies stood still, their expressions heavy, as if the weight of 17 years had suddenly come crashing down upon them. Word of the discovery spread quickly through town. For so long, people had wondered what happened to Deputy Mark Ellison, and now the answer seemed to have appeared in the most unexpected of places, just miles from where his patrol car had been found all those years ago. Forensics teams were brought in. They worked carefully, documenting every detail. The remains were collected and sent for testing, though there was little doubt among the sheriff and his deputies. Deep down, they knew this was Mark. The badge confirmed it, the boots confirmed it, and the location tied it all back to that fateful night in 1986. When the news reached Laura and the children, now adults themselves, emotions poured in all at once: shock, grief, sorrow, but also a strange sense of relief. For 17 years they had lived with uncertainty, and now, finally, they knew where Mark had been. The pain of loss returned sharply, but it was accompanied by the comfort of having answers at last. The community of Mill Creek gathered in silence as news crews once again arrived to cover the story. Reporters spoke of closure, of mystery unraveling, of the unexpected discovery in a farmer's barn. Locals gathered in small groups, talking about how the truth had been hidden in plain sight for so long. Some wondered how no one had ever thought to search the barn earlier. Others felt sadness that it had taken 17 years for the truth to come out. Back at the sheriff's office, deputies worked tirelessly to piece together what had happened. They revisited old files, compared notes, and studied the newly uncovered evidence. The barn itself became a crime scene, carefully guarded as investigators searched for any sign of who had placed Mark there. For the sheriff, who had carried the burden of this case for so many years, the discovery was bittersweet. He was relieved that Mark had been found, but sorrowful that justice had not been served earlier. Standing in the barn, he whispered quietly, "We never stopped looking for you, Mark. We never forgot." The town felt the same. Though grief weighed heavily, there was also a collective sense of closure. The unanswered questions had tormented the community for years, and while not every mystery was solved, they finally knew that Deputy Mark Ellison had not abandoned them. He had not disappeared by choice. His life had ended near the very place he had sworn to protect. The discovery of the badge, the boots, and the remains was more than just evidence. It was a reminder of the man who had once patrolled their streets, who had cared for their children, who had waved at neighbors with a smile. It brought back memories of who he was before the night of his disappearance, and those memories, though painful, were cherished once more. As the remains were prepared for a proper burial, the entire town of Mill Creek came together. People who had once been children when Mark vanished returned as adults, standing beside older generations, united in respect. The barn, once just an old building on a quiet farm, had become the place where a mystery was finally answered. And yet, even with the discovery, one final question lingered: who had hidden him there? That answer, too, was waiting to be uncovered. When the remains found in the barn were confirmed to belong to Deputy Mark Ellison, the entire town of Mill Creek felt both relief and sorrow. For 17 years, people had lived with uncertainty, whispering theories, and passing along guesses. Now, at last, the mystery had broken open. But one large question still lingered: how had he ended up there, and who was responsible? The sheriff's office reopened the case with renewed energy. Files that had gathered dust for years were brought back into the light. Investigators carefully compared the old notes with the new evidence uncovered in the barn. Every lead, every interview, every detail from 1986 was reviewed again. Forensic experts studied the badge, the boots, and other fragments found near the remains. The barn itself was examined inch by inch. Investigators searched for fingerprints, tool marks, or anything that might offer a clue. Though time had washed away many details, certain signs pointed in a clear direction. It became evident that Mark had not gone there on his own. Someone had placed him there deliberately. Attention turned back to the original list of suspects from the 1980s. Names were checked against old police records. Among them was a man who had lived near Mill Creek at the time of Mark's disappearance. He had a history of trouble with the law and had been arrested by Mark a few years earlier for theft. At the time, there had been whispers that he might have held a grudge. Investigators realized this man's property was not far from the barn where Mark had been found. But there was one complication: he had passed away years earlier. With his death, many answers had gone with him. Still, investigators pieced together what they could. Testimonies from old neighbors were revisited. One recalled seeing the man near the barn on the very night Mark went missing. Another remembered unusual activity on the farm around that time. The puzzle pieces began to fit together. Though a formal confession would never come, the evidence strongly suggested that this man had been connected to Mark's fate. Perhaps Mark had gone to check on a disturbance near the property that night, and it had led him to the barn. What happened after that may never be fully known, but the discovery left little doubt that his life had been cut short there. When the findings were shared with the community, people felt a mix of emotions. Some were frustrated that the truth had taken so long to come to light, especially since the barn had stood so close to where the search began in 1986. Others were relieved that the mystery was finally, in some way, solved. For Mark's family, the news brought a strange blend of grief and peace. They finally knew he had not chosen to leave them. He had been taken from them, and that knowledge, though painful, lifted the cloud of uncertainty that had weighed them down for nearly 2 decades. A memorial service was planned, this time not to mark his disappearance, but to honor his life. The people of Mill Creek gathered in the town square, dressed in solemn black and deep blue, as officers stood in formation. Mark's framed photograph was placed at the front, next to the folded American flag and the badge that had been found with him. The sheriff, now older and slower in his movements, delivered a heartfelt speech. Deputy Ellison gave his life in service to this town. Though it has taken us 17 years, we stand here today with answers. We honor his courage, his kindness, and his dedication. And though justice came too late, we will never forget his sacrifice. The crowd listened in silence, many with tears streaming down their faces. For Laura and her children, the ceremony was both heartbreaking and healing. They stood together, holding one another's hands tightly as they watched the flag being presented to them in Mark's honor. It was a moment that closed one chapter and opened another life without questions, though still with loss. In the days that followed, people shared stories about Mark, remembering the man he had been before his disappearance. Farmers recalled how he had once helped mend a fence after a storm. Teachers remembered him visiting classrooms, telling children to always do the right thing. Parents spoke of how safe they had felt when he was on patrol. These memories began to replace the sorrowful whispers of mystery. Mark's life was remembered for what it was, not only for how it ended. The case also left the town with lessons. Many reflected on how a mystery so close to home could remain unsolved for so long. It reminded them of the importance of perseverance, of never giving up on seeking the truth. It also showed how a community could come together, even through years of silence, to keep a memory alive. For Laura, closure came not only through the discovery but also through the support of her community. People visited her home, offering meals, prayers, and kind words. Old friends and neighbors came by, some after many years, simply to say, "We never forgot him." Those words meant more than she could express. Her children, now grown, felt a weight lift from their shoulders. They had carried the uncertainty of their father's fate since childhood, and now, though grief remained, they could finally tell his story with clarity. His daughter continued writing in her journals, but now the letters to her father spoke of peace, closure, and love. His son, inspired by his father's memory, decided to pursue a career in public service not because of the danger but because of the honor his father had shown. In Mill Creek, the story of Deputy Ellison became more than a mystery, it became a tale of resilience. For years, people had wondered, whispered, and speculated. Now they spoke with certainty. He had been a man of duty, caught in tragic circumstances, but remembered with honor. His name was added to a memorial plaque at the sheriff's office, alongside other officers who had given their lives in service. As the years went on, the barn where his remains had been found was torn down, and the land was used for new farming. But people always remembered what had been uncovered there. It was no longer a place of fear, but of truth, a place where silence had finally been broken. 17 years of unanswered questions had ended in one farmer's quiet discovery. Though justice was incomplete, the truth had given the Ellison family, and the community of Mill Creek, the closure they had long prayed for. And in that truth, they found a way to move forward, honoring the past while finally stepping into the light of peace.